Chapter 5 Capture. Poor little Smudge and torn rag horse. Where is the small boy with the laughing eyes who loved you? These were Thad's thoughts as he stood holding the little toy horse and praying that Stevie might still be found alive. There outside the house, by the chimney, he began to settle his thoughts. Grown-up folk would be working along one line to find out what had become of the girls and Bo and Stevie. Thad's thoughts took a different turn. He began to ask himself, what would I have done if I had been in Bo's place and the Comanches had attacked? Bo always slept with Stevie, and he was devoted to his little brother. Why, of course, I would try to save him, and the window would be the way out of the house that I would take. Just at that moment, his thoughts were interrupted by one-eyed Johnny Ainsworth, who came running around the corner of the house. He stopped when he saw Thad. "We're taking off to see if we can trail those Indians. Thad, are you coming with us?" Thad was afraid that if he asked Pa for permission, he would tell him that he could not go. So he ran along with Mr. Johnny and got on a little bit. Giles and 10 of his company of rangers were gathered to start. "We'll scout out and see if we can strike the trail," Giles said. Then he saw Thad. He asked, "Did Pa say you could go along?" Thad did not answer. So Giles added, "Come on. We'll be coming back pretty soon. If we don't find their trail in this direction. If we do find it, you'll have to turn back right soon, because we can't have any young ones along on an Indian fight." They struck the trail of the Comanches a little way beyond the creek crossing. The Indians had been driving a large herd of horses, almost all Mr. Branson owns. There were at least 50 head. The trail was not hard to follow. The white men could make faster time than the Indians could. So Giles figured that if they overtook the Indians and proved many for his men, he could send Thad back for the others. They had not been riding for more than an hour when suddenly Mr. Johnny Ainsworth, who had been scouting ahead, came back riding hard. "I found the little one, Celie, killed by the Indians," he called. Thad wanted with all his heart to go along and fight those Comanches. He felt sure he was old enough and smart enough to make a good Indian fighter, but he knew he had to obey orders and return home. He thought of what Mr. Johnny had said about not hating even Comanches, and wondered how Johnny could feel as he did. He wondered if he, Thad, could ever come to say that he did not really hate them. At that moment, he hated every one of them with all his heart, in spite of what Preacher Heston had read from the good book about loving our enemies. That, he was certain, he could never do. Mr. Branson seemed, from the time Clem and Thad had come back to the house, to lose hope for any of his family. Mother Conway tried to reassure him. "You can never tell," she said, "what a Comanche will do. They're as liable as not to treat Lissy and the boys like their own children." Mr. Branson considered it his own fault that he had lost his family. If he had known Comanche ways better, he would never have been lured away from the house by the barking of the dogs. The thought was about to drive him out of his mind. Thad picked up the small stuffed horse again and started on the train of thought that had been interrupted. He still hoped that maybe Bo had not Bo had done the thing Thad believed he would have done in the circumstances. By now it was late in the afternoon and the sun was pouring in a golden flood through the western windows as he sat in the bedroom with the toy horse in his hand. He kept thinking of that day last spring when he had first come with his mother and Miss Ellie Clark to visit the Bransons. All the things they had done that day ran through his mind until he thought of the cave in the creek bank that the children had called their fort. His thoughts stopped there. That was it. That was where he would have gone to hide from the Comanches. It was worth looking into. Ma, he called, I'm going down on the creek for a while. I'll be back directly. All right, son, she answered him. Don't be gone long. It will be dark soon. Thad could not get there fast enough. He ran until he was out of breath. He crept along the slippery bank over the dark pool in the creek bed. He lifted the curtain of wild plum and sumac bushes gingerly. The back of his neck ran with prickles. Everything seemed as still as death. It was dark inside, and as he stood with the last of the branches in his hands, holding them aside, a voice hailed him from the dark. Thad Conway, it's you! I was afraid those Indians had found us. Another voice piped up gleefully before Thad could answer. Tad? Tad, we hide. It was Stevie, rumpled, dirty little Stevie, still in his nightgown, but alive and well. He spied the small horse that Thad held in his hand and ran to snatch it from his hand. Horsey! Stevie's horsey! And he laughed gaily, as though it had all been a happy adventure, running away in the night with Big Brother Bo and hiding to play Indians. They had eaten the food stored in the tin boxes and had drunk from a bottle of water the children always kept for their fort's water supply. Why did you stay down here so long? That asked Bo. The Comanches have been gone since morning. I was afraid to come out. I didn't know whether they had left or not. Later, I was afraid to see what I would find. I was just about to come out and see how things were. How did you happen to come here in the first place? Thad asked. When the Comanches first came, after Clem and Pa had gone to see why the dogs were barking, he told Thad, my first thought was what they would do to Stevie. So I yanked him from his bed and carried him through the window. I knew this was the safest place on the ranch, and for the time being at least, the Indians were on the other side of the house. So I headed straight for the cave. One of the hardest things Thad ever had to do was to tell Bo what waited him at the house. Bo was stunned with grief, and Thad tried to comfort him. At least you have your pa and Stevie, he reminded him. But there are only the men folk of our family left, he mourned. Willie Branson and Aunt Dulcie shouted with joy when Thad and the two boys walked in, and for a moment they seemed to think Melissa must be with them too. Dulcie cried wildly and clasped Stevie to her ample bosom, rocking him back and forth on the bed and crooning a soft tune to him. My baby, she sang over and over. My baby boy, come back to Dulcie. Finding Bo and Stevie gave Mr. Branson new hope. At least, he said, I won't go sorrowing all over all of my loved ones for the rest of my life. Poor old Aunt Dulcie had a terrible blow on the head and several gashes on her body. She moaned constantly, both because of her physical pain and from the sorrow of losing her husband. Mother and Miss Ellie had their hands full looking after her. Thad went with his father to their ranch the next day after they buried the dead. They brought back a light buckboard with a couple of driving mules hitched to it to bring Aunt Dulcie home where Mother Conway could care for her. Stevie went home with them too. They had found a few of his clothes, but none of Beau's or Mr. Branson's. Only a few to belonging to the girls and to Mrs. Branson. Comanches had either burned or stolen all the others. If Dulcie gets well, Mother said, she can stay with us and look after Stephen. Beau and his father also went home with the Conways, but later Wiley went to work with the Rangers, who were searching for the Indians who had broken up his family. 3 or 4 weeks passed before the searchers came home again. They brought a haunch of buffalo meat, but that was all. We found out for sure that it was Yellow Cloud's band. They split up and hit both the Branson place and ours, Giles said. How did you learn that? His father was skeptical. Some Tonkawa hunters we met had run across their trail out on the prairie west of here and followed them until they had come together again. They know Yellow Cloud well. Couldn't you find them again? By the time we got to where the Tonkawas had seen them, Yellow Cloud and his band were gone. No telling where. Maybe into Indian territory, where they will be safe. Maybe into Mexico, where they'll also be safe. There was no trail we could follow after we got about 75 miles west of here. We're not giving up yet, Reed said. We're going to get some scouts from the Tonkawas and some more rangers. I'm going to make it my personal business to find Melissa or learn what has become of her, Wiley Branson said. I hope you all will look after my other two and Dulcie. My hands, Clem, Jed, and Sully will look after my cattle. They can all stay here with us and welcome, said Mother Conway. For the rest of the summer, Thad's thoughts were constantly on Melissa Branson. Where was she? And was she alive? If so, how were the Indians treating her? Sometimes he felt he could not bear not knowing. The thought of what had happened to little Celie and her mother haunted his dreams. But that was over and nothing could be done about it. Melissa, he hoped, was still alive. It was hard for him to know what to wish for her. Beau Branson was seldom at the Conway home, for he spent most of his time with his father's cowhands, looking after their cattle. But Stevie, with his happy, innocent ways, brought a great deal of pleasure to the Conway family. He loved Dulcie, who had been his nurse all his life, and since he could not understand the tragedy that had come to him, he was happy. Dulcie, who was rapidly recovering from her wounds, would not let him out of her sight. He's all I got left of my family, she would say. Ain't nobody gonna hurt him except over Dulcie's dead body. A boy of the Texas frontier in those days learned to ride a horse even before he could remember, and he would no more have left the horse without a lariat coiled on his saddle and his gun in its holster than he would have started out without breeches. Thad had spent every spare minute of his life working with his rawhide lariat, twirling it in fancy loops, settling it around the neck of some unfortunate dog or calf or colt. Later on it was the range horses and cows that he practiced on. He also practiced shooting every day, either in search of meat for the family, such as antelope, deer, turkey, or quail, or on targets thrown in the air for him. This was no idle play, for handling a rope and shooting straight were necessary skills of a cattleman's daily work. Thad had become expert with rope and gun. Now he was in dead earnest when he did his practicing. He had it in his mind that when spring come, should come, he would go on his own search for Melissa Branson. It was only a hazy notion, and he had worked out no details of his plan, but he believed that somehow he would be able to help rescue her if she was still alive by being the best shot and the best hand with the rope that he could make of himself. But he never had a chance to try out his rescue plan. One day in late October, Thad and his brother Travis went up the creek about 2 miles to round up some cows with half grown calves that their father wanted them to bring in to feed for the winter. Trav was doing a little wild turkey hunting on the side. Thad was riding a little bit. It took about it took only an hour or two to round up the cattle and head them toward home. But he had noticed as they rode up the creek there were many large, thin-shelled pecans here, more than around the home place. He decided to gather some of these finer nuts to take home. Thad had something of the nature of a squirrel. He loved to gather wild produce in season. For that purpose, he generally carried a bag strapped to the cantle of his saddle for gathering whatever he could find. By this time, Travis had shot two wild turkeys and had them to his saddle. Trav, Thad said, how about starting on home with these cows without me? What have you got up your sleeve, young'un? His brother wanted to know. I'd like to pick up some of these big pecans. There are a lot of them under these trees, Thad replied. Sure, run along, Thad, but don't go too far. I can travel pretty fast with these cows, and I don't want to have to holler you in. It was now so late in the fall that they felt sure the Comanches had gone away for the winter. Therefore, the boys felt fairly safe. But that, in later years, was to wonder at the chances they so often took. As soon as a Comanche raid was over and the chase made, the frontiersmen prowled about alone as though there was nothing in the world to fear. Thad tied Little Bit to a tree on the high bank because his pistol and belt hampered him in stooping to pick up pecans. He unbuckled the belt and threw it with the gun across Little Bit's saddle. Going down into the sandy bed of the creek, under the canopy of the tall pecan and cottonwood trees, began to fill up his sack with the pecans that lay thick beneath some of the trees. A few nights before, there had been a heavy frost that had opened the holes and brought the ripe nuts down in a hurry. Now and then Thad could hear the pop of a late falling nut as it rattled 50 feet or more and hit the gravel of the creek bed. As he stooped to gather the nuts, Thad heard a slight sound that he knew was not made by any nut dropping. A chill came over him, for he realized that by now Travis and the cows would be too far away for him to catch up with them quickly. Even Little Bit was a good way from him, for he had worked farther up the creek as he gathered pecans. She was grazing on the mesquite grass on the high bank of the creek downstream from Thad. The feeling of chillness had nothing to do with the weather. It grew on him as he stopped to pick up his half-filled bag of pecans, and he intended to start back to where he had left Little Bit. As he climbed from the green twilight of the heavily shadowed creek, he heard Little Bit snort with fright. Then he started to run. At that same moment, a scent filled his nostrils, an odor made of smoke and grease, horse and oily skin. Indian smell. He caught the sound of quiet running steps behind him. Then he was seized from the back around the neck. A brown arm was under his chin, and two dark hands pinned his arms to his side. One Indian had seized him from behind, while another had him in front. It was impossible for him to jerk loose. He kicked and bit and screamed with rage and fright. He heard Little Bit squeal, and then he could hear her foot beats going away from him. He had left her tied, so someone must be riding her. Hoping against hope that Travis could hear him, Thad yelled as loudly as he could, "Trav, Injuns, run for your life! They've got me!" But he knew that Travis was too far away. A firm hand clasped his mouth and smothered his cries. He sank his teeth into the hand and received for his pains a sharp slap on the face that rocked his head on his neck. A whack over his head with a stick from the other Indian brought the blood streaming down his forehead and face and sent his brain spinning. They pulled him along among the timber and across the stream in the bed of the creek. Half dazed, he stumbled now and then, and each time received a kick or a blow on his back or head. He felt as though he were half dead when he was finally pulled up the opposite bank, half a mile upstream from where he had been captured. He was tight and frozen inside, and his legs would scarcely bear him up. Here they stepped and were joined by a band of 8 more Comanche braves. Thad now took the opportunity to inspect his captors. Heretofore, he had only had the impression of ugly painted faces, naked brown bodies, and a big stick that one of them wielded. The newcomers laughed when they saw Thad. All were painted in what he came to know as the colors for war and death. Both their faces and their bodies were stripped and splotched with white and yellow and red. Some were in fanciful patterns. There were large areas painted in solid black, too. All wore moccasins and breechcloths, except for some who wore bear claw necklaces and one or two who had headdresses of buffalo horns. These were young braves, he discovered. Each had a rolled bearskin or buffalo robe on his horse. Thad had the feeling that he was the first white person his captors had taken, for they were obviously boasting to the others of their bravery. He learned afterwards that they stumbled onto him as they were picking up pecans after a raid on the Morton Ranch, 7 miles up the creek. Later, as they got on the high ground, he could see the smoke of the still burning buildings. He noticed with a sick heart evidences of 3 members of the family who had been killed by the braves. During that day, they were joined by other Indians. The newcomers, most of them older than Thad's captors, would pull him about by the arm, looking him over and talking among themselves. Eventually, one of the chiefs issued an order, and the two who had captured Thad began to pull his clothes off of him. The Indians then threw the captive astride a horse across whose bony back were tied a jangling collection of kitchen pots, pans, and iron skillets. With every movement of the horse, their edges dug into Thad's flesh. Because his hands were tied, he could not shift them. His legs and back were rubbed raw at the end of the day's ride. As they rode, Thad thought with shame how he had been captured because of his own carelessness. They traveled in a direction slightly north of west, and after 2 hours were joined by a hard-riding band of 12 more braves, who were driving a loose herd of 16 horses. A familiar nicker from among them brought Thad's head around, and there was his poor little bit. Again in the hands of the Indians, she was so despised. It did not make him feel any easier to remember that his actions were the cause of her being captured. A boy only a little older than Thad was riding Little Bit, and he grinned triumphantly as he rode past as close as he could come. His name, Thad was later to learn, was Scarpony, the name being taken from his claim of Thad's pony, and the scar she bore on her hip. Father had been right when he guessed that it was a boy who'd taken a fancy to Little Bit, and who stole her back as often as she escaped from him. Thad was boiling with anger inside, but he was not about to risk another beating, so he kept still. He was hurting from head to foot, but the worst hurt of all came from seeing Scarpony aside Little Bit.